back to Sunday Seminary Online. Hi, welcome back to Sunday Seminary Online. I'm Brennan. We're going to continue our study of the prophets of the Exile in the Old Testament. We're on week 16 now. We have worked through the book of Jeremiah, and now we're focusing on the book of Ezekiel. Last time we talked about the backbone of the book of Ezekiel, the thread that ties together and holds together the entire book, its structure in a way, and that was the Ark of the Covenant Ark. Today we're going to talk about chapters 4 through 7, which fit in between the first two of those appearances of the upgraded Ark of the Covenant, the Ark 2.0. And that's chapters 4 through 7. This is the core of Ezekiel's message, basically, his message of his oracles of judgment against Judah and Jerusalem. We're going to see more of these. They're going to come back again and again. And next time we'll talk about Ezekiel's prose essays, Ezekiel's theology, really, that we might see as kind of developed ideas, which are challenging and offer some new and different ideas to the history of Israel. So, in any event, I'll show you here. This is our ark here. So Ezekiel chapters 1 through 3 were the mobile throne, right? The message is that God can be with you no matter where you are. Ezekiel chapters 8 through 11 were those difficult chapters where the glory departed the temple and there was the destruction of Jerusalem, a way of thinking about the end of at least that part of Jerusalem's life as a city, but also God's reluctance to abandon the place and God's desire for a new Jerusalem, which we see at the end in chapters 40 through 48, which ends with the promise of God's presence. So this is that ark narrative, right, of God's ability to be with us no matter where we are, of God's willingness to abandon, not fully abandon, right, but abandon in times of terrible turmoil and complete moral depravity, we might say, that God will turn God's back on a certain place, in certain times, if people have committed to complete injustice. So again, this is kind of parallel to what happens in Egypt with Pharaoh's army in the Exodus. But then God doesn't, that's not the end, right? It's the same idea with Jesus' resurrection, right? That the end is not the end. Death, destruction, those exist, and they're part of this world. They're part of our experience. But that's never the actual end of the story. God always has more to say and more to do to generate life and newness. So now we can kind of take a look at the book as a whole. And so again, chapters 1 through 3, that's that first vision of the mobile throne. God is with you no matter where you are. Chapters 4 through 24 are oracles against Jerusalem and Judah. That contains that second vision. But 4 through 7 are sign acts. 6 and 7... you can fit in there, but 4 through 5 are one sign acts. I'll explain what that is in a minute, and we'll spend some more time with that in particular. 6 through 7 are judgment oracles, 7 being a poem. We'll talk about those today. And then we get another bit of that temple ark, the vision of God leaving the temple. I'm going to move my head here so you can see. And then we have judgment and visions, parables, and essays in chapters 12 through 24. That's what we'll focus on next week. And then we shift away from Judah. In chapter 24, we hear about the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem. And this marks a pivot point. Once Jerusalem is destroyed, the words of judgment against Israel are gone. There's a little bit more that kind of continues, but God shifts. And the shift first comes into the oracles against the nations. So once Jerusalem is destroyed, God then begins to judge the nations around Judah and Jerusalem, many of whom have contributed to the destruction of Jerusalem, like Babylon. And then in chapters 33 through 39, we hear about the restoration of Judah and Israel, many beautiful oracles of salvation here. And then we end with that third vision of the restored temple. So that's kind of the book as a whole. Notice the arc winding throughout. I've made green. The red the chapters are oracles of judgment. The blue are kind of the oracles of judgment against other nations, not Judah. And then chapters 33 through 39 are in green because they are the oracles of salvation. So you can see we move overall from judgment towards salvation, just like in many other books, prophetic books in the Bible. So chapters 1 through 3, as I said before, were Ezekiel's kind of commission, right? Seeing that initial ark. But then in chapter 4, we pivot from Ezekiel being told, you're going to be the sentinel, right? You're going to be the kind of the watchtower. You're going to tell the people that danger is coming. And they're going to have to make decisions about what to do with that information, whether to believe you or not believe you, or really what to do with it, right? But remember also, Ezekiel was told not to talk. So Ezekiel communicates with God, we imagine, through speech in his mind or through his heart, so prayer. But he appears to be silent here. So what does Ezekiel do if he can't speak? Well, he acts things out, a bit like street theater. We might call these symbolic acts or sign acts, right? Ezekiel's doing things to try to show people without using words what God wants to say. It's a bit like that St. Francis of Assisi quote, preach the gospel, use words if necessary, right? Well, with Ezekiel, you might say, preach God's oracles of judgment, use words if necessary, or maybe he can't even use words. There are other prophets too. Jeremiah has sign acts, but Ezekiel's are quite stunning. And let's maybe think about them as we read about them here. Just try to think about what would you do, if you were in Ezekiel's shoes, or if you were actually in the shoes of a passerby, right? So you can see over here, this is an artist's description or our artist's depiction of what it might have been like for people just kind of walking by in the street to see Ezekiel doing what we see and read about in chapter 4. So let's take a look at chapter 4 then. So, and you, O mortal, this is God speaking to Ezekiel. It picks up right where chapter 3 left off, so it's almost like nothing's, we're in the same story, right? Ezekiel's having this vision by the river. God is telling Ezekiel, you're going to be a sentinel, you're going to preach your message, but not with words. And you, O mortal. And remember, mortal is used to kind of distance Ezekiel from God and to say, you're not a big deal, Ezekiel. So, and you, O mortal, take a brick and set it before you. So a brick, we might say a piece of fired clay or something, means a tablet or something like that. On it, portray a city, Jerusalem, and put siege works against it. So Ezekiel is supposed to draw a picture of Jerusalem and put siege works against it. So maybe either draw siege works or build them. So here the artist's, reconstruction of this is that Ezekiel drew a picture of a city and is literally building like a clay, or sandcastle around it. Siege works would have been, there are a lot of things people could have done, but generally big walls that the enemy would build that would slope up towards the city. And other sometimes towers that they would build to be able to shoot into the city or drop things into the city, or as kind of a ramp to allow enemy soldiers to enter the city to get over the wall. So build all this stuff that looks like siege warfare around it, cast a ramp up against it, set camps against it, and plant battering rams around it all around. Then take an iron plate and place it as an iron wall between you and the city. So Ezekiel builds the city, then builds this, enemy army surrounding it and siege works. And my guess is that people passing by would be like, "What are you doing, Ezekiel?" And he doesn't do anything, keeps working, and people kind of gather around him to see what he's doing. What's this guy doing? Remember, we know that the elders would gather in Ezekiel's house just to be near him. So this might be he would have been causing a stir probably by doing this. So then he's supposed to take this iron plate and put him between him and the city. And then set your face toward it, that is, toward the iron plate, and let the city be in a state of siege and press the siege against it. This is a sign for the house of Israel. So Ezekiel in this seems to be playing the role of God. So Ezekiel is playing the role of God. Remember, a prophet is an emissary of God or a messenger of God, so could play the role of God from time to time. And sometimes when the prophet would speak and say, "I," that was kind of in God's name, right? Or in the voice of God. So Ezekiel's playing the role of God, and there's a big iron bar, an impenetrable kind of shield in a way, keeping Ezekiel from interacting with the city. Then Ezekiel goes and plays with the city a bit and makes the siege kind of happen, and then goes and sits back and behind the iron plate and pretends to be God. That is that God is not noticing, and that your prayers are going to hit an impenetrable iron wall, and you're pleased to God and screaming at God and so on. God's not paying attention, right? God has created kind of a fortress of solitude so that God isn't swayed by the situation, the terrible situation in Jerusalem. In other words, God has decided, and there's nothing that anyone can do to change God's mind. That is, that things have gotten so bad that God is determined to unbuild the city. Now, this is a sign. That is, it's created for people who are watching so that they can change. Now, these are people in exile, though. That is, these are people who have already been taken into exile in 597. There's an idea that maybe, they're still in communication with the people back in Jerusalem. So there's two parts to this. One part might be, can they let people know in Jerusalem in time? Hey, this is what's going to happen. Jeremiah is right, in other words. Remember, Jeremiah is still in the city of Jerusalem preaching, and Ezekiel's saying something very similar in kind of acting form in Babylon. So that there's one side of it. Maybe he's trying to persuade people. There's another part of it, though, too, which is that he might be explaining to the people who are in exile already what's about to happen and what's going to happen, so that when it does happen, they don't lose faith, that they continue living, and they continue believing and trusting in Ezekiel and in Yahweh. We're going to see in just a little bit why Ezekiel thinks it's so important for the people in exile to keep their faith. And I'll go ahead and spoil that, but he believes that they are the remnant. The people who went into exile are the ones that God is particularly preserving in order to be the new seed of faith that is going to return. So in any event, it's a overall it's a terrifying message that Ezekiel is giving, but from his perspective, for the people who are seeing it in person, it's a message of hope. God is going to destroy Jerusalem, and yet we are going to return. God is going to bring us back once again. But this is the difficult part of that. It's after chapter 24 that he begins to say those words. But if Ezekiel is explaining in advance what's going to happen, the people in exile are going to be that much more understanding when Ezekiel begins to tell them that God has new plans for them. So that's the first part there, verses 1 through 3. And then in verse 4, then lie on your left side and place the punishment of the house of Israel upon it, upon the side of your body. So Ezekiel's supposed to lay on his side then, after he kind of does this clay model attack on Jerusalem. And by the way, remember the city of Nippur, this is an ancient tablet from around the time of Ezekiel. That was an actual clay tablet that had drawn on it the walls of Nippur, a little map of Nippur. This city to which Ezekiel and other Jews had been exiled, right? So they're living next to this city. So we have evidence of people actually doing this exact same thing, drawing a little map of a city on a clay tablet. This is the kind of thing that God is talking about. Now, of course, that's a map in Nippur. We're talking about a map of Jerusalem, but it's just kind of amazing that we have the actual artifact of what God's talking about right there in a slightly different form. So, in any event, then lie on your left side, place the punishment in the house of Israel. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself with the bread here. Then lie on your left side and place the punishment of the house of Israel upon it. You shall bear the punishment for the number of the days you lie there. So here in this image, Ezekiel's lying on his side. That's kind of what happens after he plays with his toy castle. But for I assign to you a number of days, 390 days, this is verse 5, equal to the number of the years of their punishment. So Ezekiel's supposed to sit there for 390 days on his side. So over a year, right? I mean, it's been about 390 days since COVID lockdowns began, on the day that I'm recording this, which is in April of 2021. So it's been 390 days about of COVID restrictions, and that feels like a long time for me. Well, Ezekiel had to sit on his side for that entire time, and he's supposed to bear the years of punishment of the house of Israel. So Israel was destroyed in 722 BC. The nation of the northern kingdom of Israel and its capital Samaria. It was rebuilt, and there were other peoples that lived there and so on. The Samaritans, of course, but this was understood to still be kind of a time of punishment for them for abandoning the covenant. The book of Amos explains this in great detail. But so he's supposed to kind of bear this punishment for the house of Israel. And then, verse 6, when you've completed these, you shall lie down a second time, but on your right side, and bear the punishment of the house of Judah. 40 days I assign you, one day for each year. So the northern kingdom is supposed to be in exile for some 390 days. The southern kingdom is supposed to be in exile for some 40 years. It's important to know that different texts, different versions of Ezekiel, the ancient Greek version actually has a different number of years, 150 for the northern kingdom. Those years don't conform to precise chronologies no matter which version you use, but they're roundabout numbers. But the basic idea is that about 40 years later, they're going to come home, and when the punishment's over, they get to return. So this is in a way saying that it's kind of calling the shot that, kind of in a way what Jeremiah does, right? That They're going to come home not like after a generation. 40 is a round number, and it basically means a generation of time. So in a generation, we're going to return home. So the youngest of people who go into the exile might be able to go back and see the new temple, which is what we read about in the book of Ezra. But it's going to be a long time. Yet it's going to be a lot shorter than the judgment of the northern kingdom. So 390 is a lot bigger than 40. So then verse 7, you shall set your face toward the siege of Jerusalem. With your arm bared, you shall prophesy against it. Ezekiel's playing the role of God. And a bared arm, you can see here in this image, is kind of rolled up his sleeve. The arm of God is the power of God, right? So God has power here, right? See, I'm putting cords on you so you cannot turn from one side to the other until you completed the days of your siege. It's kind of like God's like, I'm gonna kind of keep you there. Those are probably not literal cords, but the idea is that God is impressing upon Ezekiel and kind of almost commanding, but almost forcing him to lie on his side for these amount of days. So that's one of these sign acts. And then there's another sign act, as if the people didn't understand enough. You're to take wheat and barley and lentils, millet and spelt, put them in one vessel and make bread for yourself. During the number of days that you lie on your side, 390 days, you shall eat it. The food you shall eat shall be 20 shekels a day by weight, and by fixed times you shall eat it. Okay, so if you've been to the grocery store recently and looked in the frozen food aisle, you might have seen something like this. That is Ezekiel 4:9 bread, which quotes this exact verse, right? Take wheat and barley, beans and lentils, millet and spelt. And you see the quotation of the verse up there. Take wheat and barley, beans and lentils and millet and spelt, put in one vessel, make bread of it. And somebody made bread, and it actually tastes delicious. I actually really like Ezekiel 4:9 bread, and they make great English muffins as well. However, take a look at what is the point of having this here in Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 9. The point of it is he's acting something out. Why in the ancient world would you take a little bit of wheat, a little bit of barley, a little bit of beans, a little bit of lentils, a little bit of millet, a little bit of spelt, and make bread out of it, instead of just making wheat bread or spelt bread? And the reason is that you're scraping the bottom of all of the barrels that you have and trying to put the remnants of all of the food that you have left together, because it might be enough to make one last loaf. So the point is that at the end of a siege, you have no food, and you're scraping the bottom of all of your barrels and putting them together to try to make them. So that's why he's doing this, to enact desperation. And then it says that you're supposed to be eating by kind of like fixed weight and at fixed times. So at fixed times, usually this is rationing. He's rationing himself. He's going to make this bread. He's going to divide it into little pieces and give himself a little bit at certain times. And then verse 11, you shall drink water by measure, 1/6, and fixed times you shall drink. He's rationing his water. He doesn't have to ration his water. Babylon's got all the water he needs, all the food he needs. He's doing this as a sign act, right? Acting out what's happening to the people back in Jerusalem, or what will happen to them. This is he's calling it in advance, right? I mean, this is before this happens. Verse 12, you shall eat it as a barley cake, baking it in their sight on human dung. So human dung is what God is telling him he needs to cook it on. A good thing we don't have Ezekiel 4:12 bread now with human dung, right? Why would Ezekiel have to use human, excrement to cook his food on? The reason is because during a siege, you run out of, you're inside a city, you run out of things to burn, but you still need to cook, and you still need to boil water and things like that. Well, whatever water you have left. And things, of course, get more and more desperate the longer you're in a siege. So eventually, the only thing you have left to burn is human refuse. Now, that is also not allowed it's impure to do that. It is a source of impurity, but especially for a priest like Ezekiel. So for Ezekiel says, I don't want to do that, right? Not just because it's gross. It has nothing to do with gross. It has to do with that's ritually impure. That would go against everything that I'm trying to keep myself pure in exile. Even though I'm in exile, right? I still want to keep that state of ritual purity. But then God says in verse 13, thus shall the people of Israel eat their bread unclean among the nations to which I will drive them. So this is also showing not just the desperate state in the actual siege of Jerusalem, but also the desperate state that people will be in after that when they are scattered. And then I said, Lord God, I have never defiled myself. From my youth up until now, I have never eaten what died of itself or was torn by animals, nor has carrion flesh come into my mouth. And he said, see, I will. And then God responds by saying, I'll let you have cow's dung instead of human dung. And that's like the concession that God makes is, okay, fine, you don't have to defile yourself. You still got to cook it over dung, though, in order to make this look like a realistic siege. All to say that this sign act is trying to explain to people and show people how desperate things are actually going to be, in hopes that they will change, that they will transform. Of course, as we know, that doesn't happen, right? No one takes him seriously enough. But that's not the last of the sign acts. So Ezekiel moves on to something else next. So in the very next chapter, chapter 5, God continues. There's no like end of quotation marks or something. Not that there's quotation marks in Hebrew, but it seems to be all kind of part of one speech. It doesn't say, and then Ezekiel did this or that. It just continues with God's speech. And you, O mortal. So this is the next part of God's speech. Take a sharp sword, use it as a barber's razor, and run it over your head and your beard. So this is a metaphor about shaving, just like we've seen Ezekiel build a little model city and play with it, almost like a toy. And then there's the metaphor of the iron wall that God couldn't see through. I mean, of course, God can see through anything, but the point is that it was kind of there was some sort of block in the way of God intervening and having pity on Jerusalem. And that block was the sins of the people. The next one, of course, was the next metaphor was about barley and mixing barley and lentils and grains, different kinds of grains together, and cooking bread over human dung to show something of the defilement of the siege. This next one is about shaving. This is really more of a metaphor. Do that two are really acting something out. This is a pure metaphor in that Ezekiel is supposed to shave. Now he's supposed to shave his head and his beard, like all of the hair. This would have been a sign of mourning. So Ezekiel is doing this in view of other people, and they would have said, why is Ezekiel starting to mourn? This would have been accompanied sometimes by kind of tearing one's clothes, putting ash on one's face or head, and crying out in lament. The purpose of that kind of lament and that kind of fasting and prayer of mourning and gnashing of teeth and so on, ripping clothes, shaving, that stuff was supposed to make someone look like they had been beat up. And the purpose was to get God's attention. When you would mourn and fast like that, the purpose was to, make sure that God saw your pain. Because if God saw how bad you felt, then clearly God couldn't turn away. And sometimes in the ancient world and modern world, right, we don't know how bad someone feels on the inside just from looking at them. So the purpose of kind of the fasting and sackcloth and all that is really to make put the inside on the outside, to make it so that it's very clear to God and everyone else who sees you that you're in a state of mourning, even if so if you wear like nice clothes, someone might miss that, right? Someone might not notice. This, of course, is something that Jesus talks about in the Gospels, but that's a later day and another lesson. But just know that this is supposed to be kind of an act of mourning, and probably a mourning for the city, right? But then he's not done. Take that hair and weigh it in the balances. I got 5 pounds of hair or something, Ezekiel would say, and divide it up into these different groups, divide it into thirds. So 1/3 of the hair you shall burn in the fire inside the city when the days of the siege are completed. So maybe this is the model city that he's made, right? So he builds a model city, he acts out the thing with the wall, then he acts out making bread. He's lying on his side for a long time too, right? And then he shaves. Presumably his hair has grown during all the acting out and this prophesying. And he weighs it out, divides it up, takes 1/3 of it, and just burns it inside his model city that he built, right? And then take 1/3, and you shall strike with the sword all around the city. So he takes a knife, that knife he probably used to shave himself, and he hacks up the hair over and over again, kind of like around this model city. And then 1/3 you shall scatter to the wind, and I will unsheath the sword after them. So he takes 1/3, he kind of throws in the wind, carries it away. That seems like a pretty strange thing to do, right? If I did that in the street today, people would be asking some questions. But here, everyone is watching, and they've seen these other sign acts that Ezekiel is doing, so they're probably interpreting them, in the same vein, we would hope at least. So chapter 5, verse 3, then you shall take from these, the ones you've kind of thrown away, a small number, and bind them in the skirts of your robe. So throw a bunch away, and a little bit save, and like kind of tie them up in your clothes. And then from these, again, you are to take some. So take a few of that few, throw them into the fire and burn them up. From there, a fire will come out against all the house of Israel. I mean, my goodness, this is a pretty developed and strange set of instructions, right? But then there's an explanation that comes afterwards. Verse 5, thus says the Lord God, this is Jerusalem. I have set her in the center of the nations with countries all around her. But she has rebelled against my ordinances, my statutes, becoming more wicked than the nations and the countries all around her, rejecting my ordinances and not following my statutes. Ordinances and statutes, all that stuff, that's a reference to the covenant. So the idea is that the people have rejected the covenant they agreed to. Therefore, this is the Lord God. You're more turbulent than the nations around you. You haven't followed these ordinances and so on. Therefore, I myself am coming against you. I will execute judgments among you in sight of the nations. Because of your abominations, and I'll explain that word in a minute, verse 9, because of your abominations, I will do to you what I have never yet done, the like of which I will never do again. So this is a promise that this is a one-time thing, and it's God is admitting it's outrageous. But then it's in response to this word abomination. So abomination is a word that's found in priestly literature in the Old Testament, like Leviticus and parts of the book of Numbers. Abomination was a concept and a word that was used outside of Israel. Remember that God is speaking to a people who come from the ancient Near East, and the things of the ancient East are familiar to these folks. So this concept of abomination was used by priests around the ancient world. And what an abomination was it was a massive ritual defilement. Remember I talked about the power plant, right? God's glory and God's holiness, God's power is something that is to be feared as well as celebrated. And the priests are the nuclear power plant team. They're the safety team, right? That's working to make sure that everyone can stay close to the power source, but also won't die. An abomination is, think of it as a massive breach of protocol. The Chernobyl incident happened because of an abomination. I forget what they were doing, in fact, that caused it, but they were like running these tests that were outrageous and breaking all of the rules that had been established in the power plant, and that's why the incident at Chernobyl occurred. That is to say, the Russian power plant that exploded and killed a lot of people and so on. There was this tremendous disaster, right? And that's what abomination means. It doesn't just mean something God doesn't like or something, or God doesn't think it's not just something that's God would say is gross or something. It doesn't really have to do with that. It has to do with the biggest breach of protocol you can imagine. This has caused God to come after them. This is terrifying language. It's troubling language, admittedly. But one of the things we can see is that in the covenant, this is talked about. So when Israel agrees to the covenant, it's there. And Israel agrees to the covenant after hearing about it. And it's in very specific circumstances. So if you turn to the book of Exodus, so if you're in Exodus chapter 19 chapters 14 and 15 are the Red Sea event, right? Where they crossed over the sea, and it's celebrated in Miriam's song and in the Song of Moses. And then chapter 19 is when they reach Sinai. And then chapter 20 through 23 is the covenant itself. That's the kind of text of what happens at Sinai. And then 24 is when they swear an oath and then have a meal to seal the covenant. So they've heard the covenant by that point. So in chapter 22, verse 21, God says, "You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. If you do abuse them when they cry out to me, I will surely heed their cry. My wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword. And your wives shall become widows, and your children orphans." It's a pretty intense thing. In the next few verses, God says, "If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you shall not deal with them as a creditor. You shall not exact interest from them. If you take your neighbor's cloak and pawn, you shall restore it before the sun goes down, for it may be your neighbor's only clothing to use is covered. And what else would the person sleep? And if your neighbor cries out to me, I will listen, for I am compassionate." And this is the same word that's used, crying out, that's used in verse 23. When they cry out to me, I will surely heed their cry. And then in verse 27, if your neighbor cries out to me, I will listen, for I am compassionate. The thing to note here is that the base of all of this is God's compassion for people who are vulnerable, for the resident alien, the orphan, the widow, the people who are poor, the people who don't have clothing, the people who need to pawn their clothing. And what else should that person sleep in? Yeah, it's there's too much to say here to go into at this point, but just to say, maybe I should do a class on the law at some point. But this is radical for ancient Near Eastern law. Ancient Near Eastern law, every other law code that we have from the ancient world, preserves the rights of the upper classes, and has much harsher laws for the lower classes and so on. There's no law that in the ancient world outside of Israel that even recognizes any rights for resident aliens or wanderers, right? They don't have any rights anywhere in the ancient world, except in Israel, where they're set as the core. And you can see in chapter 23 of Exodus, verse 9, "You shall not oppress a resident alien. You know the heart of an alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt." God chose the Hebrews because they were resident aliens who were oppressed. God liberated them so that they might recognize the oppression of others and have compassion and care for them and do something about it, right? So verse 27 of chapter 22 of Exodus, if your neighbor, what else should that person sleep in? There's like a call for compassion, like think about what you're doing to someone else, think about their conditions. There's nothing like that in other ancient Near Eastern law. No call to be compassionate to other people, to think about their condition before you do something, to recognize, kind of this motivation, like in chapter 23, verse 9 that I just read. You were aliens in the land of Egypt. It's like giving a motivation for you to follow the law. A motivation clause. There's nothing like that in modern laws either. Imagine like the state of Georgia telling you like you shouldn't speed because, think about the kids, right? That's not in the law code, but it is in the law code of ancient Israel. It wasn't in the law code of Israel's neighbors in all of their different law codes. So this at the core of this is a compassion. Compassion for the vulnerable, for the weak. And when God says in Exodus 22:23, if you abuse any widow or orphan or resident alien, when they cry out to me, I will hear their cry. That word cry is a prayer word. It's a really crucial word in the Old Testament. It doesn't just mean crying, like tears falling from your eyes. It means cry out because you've been taken advantage of, because you've been oppressed, because you've been hurt by someone who's taken advantage of your vulnerability. That kind of cry, you're crying out for help. This is the same word. This is actually the first prayer word that's ever used in the Bible. It's the word that's used of Cain and Abel. When Abel cries out, and Abel's blood cries out from the ground, God hears that cry. So God hears the cries of people who have been hurt, the vulnerable people who've been taken advantage of, and God cares about these people, and God demands justice for them, but God also demands compassion for them, and that's part of this law code. God's really serious. So in that context, God says in verse 23 of chapter 22 of Exodus, if you do abuse them, when they cry out to me, I will heed their cry. And then verse 24, my wrath will burn and I will kill you with the sword. What that means in ancient Near Eastern rhetoric, remember, like this isn't written like in our language. This isn't written in English. It's not written in modern 21st century idiom. The metaphors are from the ancient world, and from the ancient Near East in particular. And I will kill you with the sword. What that means is I will defend them. So everybody in the ancient world was supposed to have some sort of avenger. And the avenger, because there weren't usually terribly developed justice systems in the ancient world. When they did exist, they were often fairly biased in favor of the rich, as I mentioned, in favor of the powerful, the well-connected. So people had avengers. That is, there was someone powerful, physically powerful, usually, in your family. And often if they had any kind of status in the community, they would use that to their advantage too, but they would try to avenge people who had been wronged. So if someone hurts my daughter, I'm not going to look the other way, right? That's like today, I'm her avenger, right? It's not that I go trying to hurt anyone who looks at her wrong or something, or says a mean joke or something. You know what I mean? But if someone tries to hurt her, I protect her. That's what I do. And this is the language of a protector, of a defender, of an avenger. And the reason that this language is used in Exodus 22, verse 24, my wrath will burn and I will kill you with the sword, is because God is the sworn avenger precisely for those people who have no family. They have nobody who's taking care of them, nobody who can vouch for them. They don't have a defender. God swears to be their defender. So that's the context, right? That's the covenant. The covenant has at the core of it that everyone has to be sworn defenders of those who are vulnerable, who are weak, who are taken advantage of. And we have to have compassion for these people, and we have to listen to their cry. We have to hear them. We're supposed to be, the people who follow this covenant are supposed to be priests. The priestly people, they're supposed to mediate God's blessing and God's presence to all the peoples of the world. That's in Exodus 19. When they come to the foot of the mountain, God says, I want these people to be like my priests to the nations. They're not all priests, but they're like priests. They're mediating God's presence to all the nations of the world. And so if we're going to be doing that, we have to have compassion like God has compassion, and we have to kind of stand up for people the way that God would stand up for people. So if you turn back to Ezekiel then, with that in your mind, all this talk in chapter 5 about statutes and ordinances. So chapter 5, verse 5 starts by saying, you've been breaking all these statutes and ordinances. And Ezekiel just kind of leaves it there. It's like, what were they doing? It's really unclear. Later on in chapters 6 and 7, and actually it becomes more clear later on, this is very clearly people taking advantage of others, hurting the vulnerable. And there's other things too. There's bad worship. But for Ezekiel, those things are all linked together. Like, what is idolatry? It's following after a different way of living than the covenant lays out, than Yahweh lays out in the covenant. It's living like the nations around you. So not caring about, not having compassion on those people who are vulnerable around you, not seeing the image of God in them, and so on. So all to say this, Yahweh starts by saying through, to Ezekiel, look, they've broken the statutes and ordinances, they've gone after other gods and so on, but it's not just about like praying to, Buddha or something. That's not the kind of thing that we're seeing here. But God says this abomination of basically going after these other way, changing the way you're living and hurting others, right? I mean, that like building a system that is designed to dominate and hurt others. That's not allowable. God will unbuild that system. So then, if you go skip down to verse 11, so this is what the hair symbolizes the three different groups of people who are going to live through this time of destruction and unbuilding. So then verse 11, therefore, as I live, says the Lord God, that's an oath. God swears an oath. Surely because you have defiled my sanctuary with all your detestable things and with all your abominations. Again, the sanctuary gets defiled when people harm the vulnerable, when they do terrible things that are morally impure, right? The outrageous things. That's defiling the sanctuary. Therefore, I will cut you down. My eye will not spare, and I will have no pity. This is God kind of saying, what I said in Exodus 22, I'm going to do it. Verse 12, 1/3 of you shall die of pestilence or be consumed by famine among you. 1/3 shall fall by the sword around you, and 1/3 I shall scatter to every wind and unsheath the sword after them. So, some are going to die in the actual, the famine being the siege. Some people are going to die in the siege. Some people are going to die from the aftermath of the siege, the warfare that occurs after the fall of the wall and everything else. And then 1/3 will be scattered in the diaspora, and things will be difficult for them. Some will go into exile in Egypt, like Jeremiah. Some will go into Babylon. Some will go elsewhere, Asia Minor, right, or modern-day Turkey. They'll be scattered around. There'll be Jewish colonies in different places. And then I will unsheath the sword after them. And that is, like, things will be difficult for you wherever you go after this. That's probably a lot of people. That is to say, we don't have any records or we don't have any information about how many people died in this. It seems that a lot of people actually were able to get out of Jerusalem and go elsewhere, simply from all the Jewish colonies that pop up and Jewish communities that pop up around the Mediterranean basin and into the Far East, like into Persia in the following centuries after the exile. So all to say, a lot of people end up escaping, but still this 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, there's three different kind of possibilities or outcomes for you. And then verse 13, my anger shall spend itself, and I will vent my fury on them and satisfy myself, and they shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken. So this is a really perhaps strange, interesting, ancient way of thinking about people and God. So in the ancient world, and I guess a lot of us kind of think this way too. Have you ever heard of a crime of passion? The idea is that somebody committed a crime, but they were so outraged or something, so angry, so emotionally distraught that they did something that was against the law, but it's an attempt to defend them, to say like, well, they weren't in control of themselves. They kind of went out of their mind, and because they were in an emotionally overloaded state. That's kind of the way people thought in the ancient world. The passions. So there was an idea that people could deal with, and if you trained at it, if you worked hard at it, you could kind of control more emotions than other people. But everybody reaches a limit at some point, and you flip out. That is, if someone's trying to annoy you, you can take it for a while, and some people can take it more than others. But eventually, someone's going to kind of lose their lid, right? They're going to just start yelling at someone or whatever, or that there's only so much kind of reproach you can take, or only so much offense that you can take before you strike back or something. That was just an ancient idea. And when it says in the Bible, it actually says in Exodus 34, but it says this is one of the main refrains in the Old Testament. And I actually let me go ahead and read it. So in Exodus 34, this is repeated in a bunch of the different prophets. It's in the book of Jonah. It's in the book of Nahum. In Exodus 34, so this is the Moses is in the cliff, in the cleft of the rock, if you remember that. And when God goes by, Yahweh goes by the rock, and Moses is being covered so that Moses can't really see God's presence and be hurt by it. There's a big proclamation. A voice comes out and says, Yahweh, Yahweh. This is verse 6 of Exodus 34. Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. That's chesed, or covenantal love, covenantal faithfulness. So the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in chesed, or covenant love, covenant faithfulness, keeping steadfast love to the thousandth generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression of sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of parents upon children, and so on. So this beginning here, God merciful and gracious, slow to anger. So a secret here of translation is that the Hebrew for this, and like I said, this gets repeated many times. So it's in Numbers 14, Nehemiah 9, Psalm 86, Psalm 103, Psalm 145, Jeremiah 32, Joel 2, Jonah 4, Nahum 1. So, this is one this is a credo or something. This is a creed of the Old Testament. It's a little bit different every time you read it, but usually it's about the same. So God is slow to anger, and every time it says that, what it really says in Hebrew is God is long of nose. God is long-nosed. Now, the idea here is that in the ancient world, everybody, it's not just Israel, but like the Canaanites had this idea, and Mesopotamia, I think you can find this metaphor. But the idea was that your nose was like a fuse. Like you think about like lighting a bomb, like light a match, you light the fuse, and the fuse, and then it eventually explodes. People's noses were understood to be kind of like a fuse. This is all metaphor, right? They didn't really think this, but they talked about your nose as being a fuse, and like if someone was trying to get at you or pester you or antagonize you, if you were short of nose, that meant you had a short temper, you had a short fuse, and if you were long of nose, that meant you had a long fuse. It had nothing to do with your actual like physiognomy. It had nothing to do with how you looked, right? Having a long nose just meant that you had long patience, you were long enduring. So God is long-nosed. Slow to anger is the translation, because that's what it's trying to get at. That's what it means, right? That God doesn't get angry quick. God abounds with love and faithfulness and so on. It takes a long time, and you have to do a lot of things to make God mad, which is also what Ezekiel is saying. This has been hundreds of years of deep and structural oppression that God's been asking the people to change. And God sent all these prophets, and God has, done a lot of things. I mean, and especially the first incursion of Nebuchadnezzar in 597 is understood by Ezekiel, the first loss of Jerusalem, right, when the temple still stands and so on. It's meant to be like kind of a warning shot, a shot across the bow, but the people don't listen, they don't change. And so Ezekiel's saying, finally God's, in verse 13 of chapter 5 of Ezekiel, God's anger finally has ignited. And when God's anger finally ignites, God kind of goes out of control. This is the way, again, Ezekiel talks about it, because Ezekiel's an ancient Near Easterner. Now, I don't think this is like, good theology in that sense, but it's just, this is the way that it all made sense to them in the ancient world. So we might think about ways that we would translate this to our own day today. But all to say, so verse 13, this is also part of that ancient idea about emotions, or the passions, is that eventually they spend themselves, and then you can kind of return to normal. It's almost like, you kind of hit the limit, and then you got to kind of empty yourself of anger, and then you're at zero again, and you can start to build up, and you can be like long of nose again, right? So the bomb blows up, and then after a little while, everything's okay. So verse 13, my anger shall spend itself. I mean, that idea, my anger will eventually, I'll get I'll empty my tank of anger. And I will vent my fury on them and satisfy myself. And satisfy doesn't mean like be satisfied, like be happy with this. It means like I will kind of spend my tank of anger. And then they shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken in my jealousy. And again, like I mentioned last week, jealousy meaning God's zealousness, God's love for the people, and also God's faithfulness to the covenant, God's expectation that the people are going to be faithful also to the covenant. When I spend my fury on them. So again, spending fury. I mean, the idea is kind of that there's this, they've reached the limit. Moreover, I'll make you a desolation and an object of mocking among the nations. I mean, this stuff is supposed to be terrifying. It's not supposed to be like nice. But this is supposed to also transform. This is all being said before this happens, right? So the idea is that hopefully someone understands some of this and changes their ways. This is again following that tradition of God sending prophets to tell people before something happens about what will come about. And one more thing about this kind of passions is that people get the idea, I think, from something like Ezekiel 5, that God really loves this. God loves the Old Testament God sometimes. I mean, good Lord, there is no difference between Old Testament God, New Testament God. If you're a Christian, right? It's not there's an angry God that got done away with Jesus on the cross or something. But the God's anger and fury you can find also in the New Testament in places like Revelation, right? But it's not just that God is purely angry or something. It's that this is all like God, like in Jeremiah when God is crying as God is doing this, right? So in Ezekiel chapter 6, verse 9, those of you who escape shall remember me among the nations where they are carried captive, how I was crushed by their wanton heart. This is God speaking. I was crushed by all this. Like the events of all of this are crushing to God too. So in any event, this is, it's not that God's delighting in this kind of thing. But in chapter 6, we get another different word. So this word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, and it seems that he can write stuff. He can't speak, right? But he can write things down. He seems to write letters elsewhere. So maybe he's writing some of these things down. But, O mortal, set your face toward the mountains of Israel. So you remember I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, the different mountains and mountain peaks that are throughout Jerusalem and throughout the entire area of Israel. So other peoples like the Philistines lived in plains. There were some valleys and kind of plain areas that were in Israel, but mostly it was mountainous area, mountainous region. So these different mountain peaks would surround, like here, Mount Zion. Here's Mount Zion in the middle. Mount Zion in the middle, and it's surrounded by these other hills that kind of ring it, right? And you think about like Psalm 121, I lift my eyes up to the mountains, where does my help come from? So you're in Jerusalem, you look up and you see these other mountains kind of towering over you and surrounding you. There would be watchtowers there would be fortresses there to try to defend Jerusalem. So during a time of siege or a time of battle, like when you're expecting the enemy to arrive, you'd be looking up to these mountains to see signal fires and things like that, or to hear about what was happening. But also on these hills, there were, and we read about this in the book of Kings, there were always these altars, sometimes to Yahweh, sometimes to other gods. And like Hezekiah and Josiah, they make a big deal about tearing down these altars to other gods that occur. So, O mortal, set your face toward the mountains of Israel. And this is, being spoken to someone who's in Al Yehudu, which is outside Nippur in Babylon, but remember he can kind of see Jerusalem. So, and say, you mountains of Israel, verse 3 in chapter 6 of Ezekiel, you mountains of Israel, hear the word of the Lord God, or Yahweh God. Thus says Yahweh God to the mountains and the hills, to the ravines and the valleys, I myself will bring a sword upon you, and I will destroy your high places. So here God is judging the mountain peaks themselves. Now, again, it's a kind of a metaphor in a way for the idolatry of the people, the faithlessness of the people. Your altars shall become desolate. God's going to destroy the high places. That means these altars that are unsanctioned, not the altar in Jerusalem, but these are the other altars that appear that typically will worship other gods or might worship Yahweh, but are used for, let's say, maybe the nationalistic state religion or something like that. Something that's not the religion that Ezekiel is imagining, or Jeremiah, let's say, would imagine that the people would follow the kind of what they would call true religion, right? Of course, there's always a fight over what that means, but in any event, verse 4, your altars should become desolate, your incense stands shall be broken, I will throw down your slain in front of your idols. So there's going to be a consequence to all this, is what God is saying here. And I will lay the corpses of the people of Israel in front of their idols. I will scatter your bones around your altars. The scattering of bones around altars would defile those altars. The idea of corpses being near them, it's all defiling. So these altars that are unsanctioned would still follow the kind of purity rules of the ancient Near East in general. And you can see the same kind of thing happening in 1 Kings 13. These stories about kind of scattering bones on altars to defile them and so on. Josiah does this as well. There's actually been found, well, in any event, I'll explain more about that later. But there's actually, so during Josiah's Reformation, there's one town where there's an altar that seems to have been not to Yahweh, an altar to another god that was in the gate space of a Judahite town. And so in this little niche, when people would pass by, there was this altar to some other god. And during Josiah's Reformation, they seem to have set up a latrine on top of it so that people would literally defile the idol with their dung, which, as we see from Ezekiel chapter 4, is impure. So this idea of defiling other altars and idols and so on was pretty common in the ancient world. This is the same thing that happens in the book of Daniel, by the way, the abomination of desolation, which is when the Syrian soldiers that Antiochus IV, a king who takes over Jerusalem, and then he stations these Syrian soldiers and gives them the Jerusalem temple. And the Syrians worship a god, Baal Shemayan, Baal of the heavens, and they sacrifice typically pigs to that god. And which is, they're not trying to defile the altar, they're trying to use it, but this not kosher blood, right? This pig blood is used to in the sacrifices on this altar to a different god, and that's the abomination of desolation, which they have to cleanse the altar once they retake the temple, and that's what Hanukkah is, the rededication, the recleansing of the temple and the altar. That's the festival that remembers that day, right? So, all to say, these idols will be destroyed, wiped out, and so on. And then verse 8 of chapter 6, but I will spare some. And this is the idea of a remnant, the remnant theology, which is very common in the prophets of the Old Testament. And the idea is that God is unbuilding, but God is actively sparing some. Sometimes the remnant is described as the people who deserve to be spared. Sometimes it's just kind of a random group of the people, depending on the prophet and even within certain prophetic texts. But here, some of you shall escape the sword among the nations and be scattered among their countries. Those of you who escape shall remember me among the nations when they were carried captive, and how I was crushed, right? You'll remember Yahweh's feeling of being crushed. By their wanton heart when they turned away from me, by their wanton eyes when they turned after other idols. Then they will be loathsome in their own sight for the evils they've committed. People will kind of repent. And then God says, then they shall know that I am the Lord, and I did not threaten in vain or for no reason to bring this disaster upon them. So that's the terrifying bit of this text, but also the promise and the hope too. So again, this is the the kind of deforming and reforming that God is promising. It's not hope in the sense that everything's going to be just like you want it to be, right? Everything's going to be just fine. But in any event, this in chapter 7 we get a poem about the disaster that is about to come, and we get a little bit more detail about what exactly was wrong. Why is God so mad? And we hear a lot about money. So God says that disaster and end is going to come. Things are going to change, right? Finally, something big is going to change in Jerusalem. Verse 7, Your doom has come to you, O inhabitant of the land. The time has come. The day is near of tumult, not of reveling in the mountains. The day of the Lord was a big deal for in the prophetic tradition, and it seems that the book of Amos is the oldest book that mentions this, but Amos seems to be parodying it. What that means is that the day of the Lord was older than Amos, and Amos seems to be like mocking it almost. And the day of the Lord started, it seems, as a nationalistic day of festival when they would anticipate Yahweh coming and just killing all of Israel's enemies. Amos says that's not what the day of the Lord's about. It's not about God coming and like giving you everything you wanted, candies and rainbows and hurting all of your enemies. Instead, it's God showing up and asking you what you did. Did you help the weak and the vulnerable? That's what Amos is all about. And so Ezekiel is drawing that imagery too. The time has come, the day is near of tumult, not of reveling in the mountains, right? The day is coming, the day not of like Yahweh's going to save you, the day when Yahweh comes and says, what are you doing, right? Babylon is an element of God's salvation of Jerusalem, according to Ezekiel. And that salvation is going to be difficult. It's going to be terrible. But at the same time, if God just came and kicked out the Babylonians, awful things would continue. That's not salvation. So this what is this day, right? This day it comes, and so on. And then verse 12, the time has come, the day draws near. Let not the buyer rejoice, nor the seller mourn, for wrath is upon all their multitude. For the sellers shall not return to what has been sold, as long as they remain alive. For the vision concerns all their multitude. It shall not be revoked because of their iniquity. They cannot maintain their lives. So the iniquity of the buyers and the sellers seems to be, and the rejoicing of the buyers and the sellers seems to be what God actually has in mind. And then this returns in verse 19. They shall fling. This is like what happens when the disaster comes. They shall fling their silver into the streets. Their gold shall be treated as unclean. And then their silver and gold cannot save them on the day of the wrath of the Lord. They shall not satisfy their hunger or fill their stomachs with it, with their silver and gold, right? So if you look through Ezekiel 7, like abominations is mentioned a lot, like the iniquity is mentioned a lot, but like what is it? Like what is the iniquity? What is the abomination? The thing that's mentioned all throughout this chapter is buying and selling money, finding, like verse 20 of chapter 7, from their beautiful ornament, which they took in pride, they made abominable images, detestable things. Therefore I'll make of it an unclean thing to them. I will hand it over to strangers as booty and plunder, and so on. They profane my treasured place. I mean, there's a lot of different ways of God getting at this. That like, what do you treasure? What do you really want? And it seems to be that this the terrible iniquity had to do with buying and selling, had to do with people probably taking advantage of other people. And there's more later that we'll get into as well, by the way, in Ezekiel. But it does have to do with taking advantage of the weak and the vulnerable through commerce in Ezekiel 7. This is pretty much what Amos got mad about in Amos as well. So what Micah got mad about, this is what Isaiah was really mad about. Just if you got a question about it, just read Isaiah chapter 5. That's where Isaiah lays out all of his indictments. He's mad about people of means stealing the land and the houses of the people who can't defend themselves. I mean, this seems to be the core. I mean, it goes back to that bit that I read in Exodus chapter 22, the core of the covenant, that God is defending, standing up for these folk who can't defend themselves, and that they've been taken advantage of. So this is ultimately what this kind of God is mad at the mountains, right, in chapter 6, and God is mad primarily at those who have hoarded their silver and gold and committed great iniquity and abomination by not having compassion on their neighbor in chapter 7. And then chapters 8 through 11 is that second vision, right? So now we've actually gone through, we didn't go through in order, but right, chapters 1 through 11 we've actually read through. And then there's actually more kind of indictments and judgments and so on in chapter 12. and 13 and 14 and so on. What we're going to talk about next time, though, is Ezekiel's creative and interesting use of moral allegories and his prose. He writes these kind of long prose think pieces, essays, you might want to call them. So his essays, his parables, his allegories that he writes, some of which are quite remarkable, and some of which challenge the received wisdom and theology of the day. So chapter 18 is one that we're going to spend a long time thinking about with the individual retribution. So if you read chapters 17 and 18, and actually, let's see. Yeah, 17 and 18 are going to be ones that we focus on a lot next time. But we're also going to talk about some difficult texts next time, including chapters 16 and 23, which are some of the hardest texts for me to read in the Bible. So, this is a difficult thing, stuff to read. But if our faith is all about us only hearing good things and nice things that we want to hear, then that makes us a lot like those inhabitants of Jerusalem who refused to listen to Ezekiel. Listening carefully to the difficult things that God has to say is actually the way of hope. It's the way to restore, and it's the way to avoid tragedy. May we keep our ears open to listen for the voices of those who are vulnerable, for the voices of those who are crying out, and may we spring into action to help. Peace be with y'all. See you next week.